Hey, I'm Eric Kennedy. I'm a freelance UX and UI designer, and I've also taught thousands of students design via my online course, Learn UI Design. Today, we're going to be doing an interactive crash course in the design app Figma. And Figma is the most popular user interface design app in the world right now. And there's good reason for that. It does everything. Well, almost everything. Vector editing, visual design, prototyping, developer handoff, etc. You don't even have to know what all these things mean, but in 60 minutes, you will, because we're going to cover not only all of the core and basic functionality, but also some of the newest features that Figma's added in their latest release. This stuff is changing the industry right now, and you will end this tutorial both up to speed and up to date. Think about it. Now we're going to be making this design step by step, and I highly recommend pausing this video, downloading Figma, opening it up, and following along at home, since I'll be talking about a ton of very frequently used hotkeys. I don't want to teach you Figma only for you to use it slowly. I want you to be fast. And also, I'm a huge fan of realistic tutorials, so I'm going to throw in a lot of relevant user interface design tips as we go along. You'll get better at visual design while also learning Figma. Sound like a deal? Let's get started. All right, so once you've downloaded Figma, you've opened up a new file. First things first, we're going to create a desktop design. So we need to create what's called a desktop frame for the design to go in. Right now, I've just got this big blank canvas, but if I go on over to this button right here and click down, I can create a new frame. And you're going to see Figma always reminds me of hotkeys here. So this is with F or A sometimes I use. And I can press either of those, and I'm going to get this menu on the right where I can choose a frame. I can choose whether I want to design for phone, tablet, desktop, or some other stuff. In this case, we're just going to do MacBook Air. It's a fine desktop size. You know, people always ask me, what's the width that I should start with for desktop design or any size? And to be honest, above 1200 pixels wide, basically there's very few interesting layout changes. So 1280 is just fine for us. Now the deal is I can kind of do scratch work outside the design, but my design is going to go in this box here. Before we get too far along, I'll just say I can use two fingers to pinch, to zoom in and to zoom out. And I can also on a trackpad use two fingers to scroll around. So I'm going to do that plenty. But one of the most common resizing hotkeys that I'm going to use is Shift 2. And if I have a selection, Shift 2 just zooms to that selection, as you can see, and Shift 0, which brings me to 100%. But Shift 2 and Shift 0 are going to be the main ones that I will use to center my zoom. Now, we're designing a dark dashboard, so we're going to select the frame, and we're going to go to Fill here, and we're going to choose a dark color. Surprise. By the way, fill and stroke, these are the two main ways that you will color elements in Figma. Fill just refers to the color that goes inside the element, and stroke, which we'll do a little bit of later, is like the border. Now, by default, Figma is showing me the hex color system where I can go type in a 6-digit hex value, but I prefer the way more human readable HSB. So if I were you, I would just switch to that right now and basically never change it. If you're not familiar with the HSB color system, check out my primer on it linked below. The cool thing about HSB is it allows you to think about color like a human. For instance, we want a hue of about 180. That's going to be kind of a turquoise teal sort of color. And I can actually adjust it a little bit, right? If I add a little bit, I'm all of a sudden now more in the blue range or whatever. But hue is kind of where you are in the rainbow. Saturation is like how rich you are. So a very rich color is going to have a high saturation. A very pale color or a gray is going to have a low saturation. We'll just do something in the middle, 50. And then we want, B, the brightness, we want that to be pretty low. So maybe 20, 15, something like that. Now, let's add a few divider lines to the page to give it a little bit of structure. To add a line, I can go up to the shape menu and go to line here, but approximately 100% of the time, I just press the shortcut key L. So I can throw that in. And if I hold shift, I can constrain it to be horizontal, very handy. Now you're gonna notice it's black. So I've got like black on very, very dark blue right here. That's not gonna fly. So I'm gonna go to this stroke property right here and change the color to white. And literally I can type in white if I want because it's a named CSS color. I could type in the hex value of FF, 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 or cool little trick. If the hex value is the same number 6 times, you can just type that in once and press enter. So 0 for black or F for white. Very easy to do that. Now I'm going to go ahead and make another one for the sidebar. Again, I'm going to hold shift to constrain it vertically. Go here, type F, boom. By the way, just some basic moving elements here. So if I select an element and I press the arrow keys, that moves it. Big surprise there, I'm sure. If I hold shift and press any of the arrow keys, it moves it 10 pixels at a time. Honestly, I use this all the time. Super, super useful. Now, as far as positioning elements goes, I can look over here to my properties panel and I can be like, oh, this has a Y value of 72, therefore it's 72 from the top. But much more often when I have an element selected, I will hold Option, and then that allows me to see the measurements between that and other things on the screen. So if I hold down Option, I can just kind of get this, 70 pixels from the top. That's a great distance for a header. Or this sidebar, I can easily position this with Shift, arrows, and arrow keys to be 220 pixels from the side. That's good for a sidebar. All right, now design critique time. These lines are way too in your face. They're way too bright. They need to be more subtle. And this is actually a really common beginner design mistake, to make borders and dividers kind of too bright. So the easiest way to make these more subtle is to adjust their opacity. And that's the percentage number that comes after the layer, or you can deal with just the strokes opacity down here. The easiest way to change the opacity though isn't these little number boxes on the side. It's actually just to press a number key on the keyboard. So if I press 5, it automatically goes to 50% opacity. If I press 4, 40%, 3, 30%. I think you can more or less see where this is going, except to trick you, 0 actually brings it back to 100%. And if I want to make something 0% opacity, I have to press 0, 0 in rapid succession. If I do that, then it becomes invisible. Now, I don't want to do that. I'll actually just do something like, 2 for 20% opacity and call it good. All right, to further add structure to the page, we can use two helpful Figma features called rulers and grids. Rulers, to toggle the ruler visibility, just press Shift R. I'm sure it's like up in this view menu here or something too. Now, when you have rulers visible on the left side and the top here, you can actually just go ahead and drag in a ruler. And let's say I want to make this ruler 60 pixels from here. So this is at 220. I want to make the ruler at 280. Let's get that kind of nice and centered there. And then I'll make one that's just a little bit away from the right-hand side of the screen. Let's say 60 pixels again. So this is going to allow me to put a neat kind of main column of content in this area right here. Now, I'm going to be honest, I think grids are a little bit overrated in responsive, modern UI design, but you have to know them anyways. They're just sort of a design classic. And the way to make grid systems in Figma is to go select a frame. Once you've selected it, you can go to Layout Grid, add a grid, and then you're going to have to jump in here and choose columns instead of the grid default, which is actually just like vertical and horizontal lines. The most common count for columns is going to be 12, which, who are we to break with convention? I'm going to make them a little more visible, a little bit higher opacity here, just because we have such a dark background. And then I can anchor the columns either to the left, to the right, to the center, or I can have them stretch across the screen. I'm going to anchor them to the left, and then I'm going to offset them from the left side by the amount that we have. I think that was 280, and now they start where the ruler starts. Now it's just a matter of playing with the width of the individual columns until it fills our content exactly. And so 60 pixels width for a column and 20 pixels as a gutter works perfectly. Now some more hotkeys for you. If I want to hide the grids at any time, which I often do, I can do that with Control G. And if I want to hide the rulers or toggle ruler visibility, I'm going to use Shift R to do that. So there's Shift R and there is Control G. Now I want to make some grid lines for our chart, which is kind of like the main thing on the page. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start by grabbing this horizontal line. I'm going to hold down the Option key, and then it's going to make a duplicate that I can drag somewhere else. If I hold Shift, it's also going to constrain it horizontally, which actually I don't really need to do because we're going to get it lined up with that ruler. Then I can go and select this. Again, holding Shift is going to constrain it to be perfectly horizontal like that. And then I'm in this situation where I can now hold Option again. Now I definitely want to hold Shift so that these things are perfectly stacked up. And I'm going to get 60 pixels of distance in between them. And then, cool tip here, if I press Command D, it duplicates the layer. But since the first two copies were 60 pixels apart, it intelligently remembers that distance and keeps things evenly spaced. All right, Command 0 to zoom in a little bit. And let's dive in on the wonderful world of text in Figma. You can create a new text box by pressing this button, but again, 100% of the time, I just press the shortcut key T. And when I do, you click and drag, that's where your text is going to go. And I'm going to type the word dashboard. This is going to be the title of our page. And right now it's an Inter. Inter is a Google font, and Google fonts are included by default with Figma. That's fantastic. And then I can go to the text section of the properties pane, and it's fairly straightforward to make my edits here. I'm going to do size 40. I'm going to do, let's say, a bold weight like that. And this is sort of an intermediate typography trick, but I'm actually going to give it -1% letter spacing, which sort of makes a headline or a subhead just appear a little bit tighter and crisper. I don't need this big box hanging off the edge of the word. So if I just press the auto width, it's going to snap down, and the text box size will be determined by the text size. Looks good. Now, once I have a single layer of text, I can actually just hold Option and create a duplicate here. And I'm going to make the size something that makes more sense for like a side nav. So maybe that's 16, 17, somewhere around that. Again, at Command 0, I'm at a zoom of 100%, so I can see exactly what the text size will look like. So let's just do 17 for this, and let's create some items for our side nav. When I'm first prototyping out a nav like this, I may just kind of change the paragraph spacing here just to get a sense of like how big each item should be. In the end, we'll change that so that these are all separate layers, but for right now, this is just a quick way to kind of prototype things out. And apologies, because one thing I did here, and I've done this before, is when I'm in a text box in Figma, if I press the up arrow or the down arrow, it adjusts the value by 1, but if I hold shift, it adjusts it by 10 at a time. So it's the same with moving elements across the screen. This is super handy, and I do it all the time. Now this 17-point Inter font seems like a great default font size. So whenever I find a default font size, I'm just going to hold down Option, and I'm going to drag this existing text elsewhere on the page where I can edit it to be other text that I want. So maybe there's going to be a search box up here with the word search in it. We're going to have some labels for our little stats here on our dashboard. I can select both of these and Option, Shift, click and drag to create multiple new layers at a time. And I'm just going to get the text out there. I know I'm going to change the styling of these things, but again, it's just easy to duplicate what layers I have rather than trying to click and drag the specific position of every text box on the whole page. And now I've got this, top level header right here. For the secondary header, again, I'm going to hold Option and then Shift to constrain it. And I'm going to have a subtitle here that says related articles. I'm going to keep all the styling the same except the size. I'll just modify the size. And if I go down from 40 to 30, seems like that is going to work just fine. And now that I've got this size for my subhead right here, I kind of want to try it and see what it would look like for these stats right here, like these numerical stats. I know there's going to be a little bit bigger. So one real cool trick in Figma is I can right click and I can say copy paste, copy properties, but then there's a hotkey for it right here that I'll use all the time. Option Command C. But if I do Option Command C and then go to this layer, and I'm going to select both of them and do Option Command V, it's going to paste in all of the text styling. So that's pretty awesome. Now these little unit labels, I want to be kind of faded and very secondary. So I'm going to actually make them a couple sizes smaller. I'm realizing that I accidentally left negative letter spacing in all of this stuff. So I'm going to select all these layers, just holding Shift the whole time. And I'm going to give them 0% letter spacing. That's the default. And then I'm going to go back here to these little labels. And like I said, I want them to be smaller. So I'm going to do 2 font sizes smaller. And then I'll give them 70% opacity just by pressing the 7 button. And that already looks a lot better. Now again, in the name of consistency, which I always try and default to consistency in my UI design. When I make little labels for this chart here, one thing I can do is just grab the existing style and then duplicate it and use it somewhere else. In general, your design will appear neater if you use fewer font sizes versus more, and I think almost all of the time you don't need more than about 5. Now in Figma, a lot of this text styling stuff is right here, and we won't go too much into it, but there are many more quote-unquote advanced stylings that you can do via this little kebab menu, and one of them that I use the most is case. So if I change this to uppercase, that is just going to look a little bit cooler. Maybe give it a medium weight and make it a little bit smaller too. Add in some letter spacing, which is a good thing to do for uppercase. I call this the slub pattern, by the way. Smaller, lighter, uppercase, and bold. There we go. That looks good. Now, beyond adding text, another big thing you can do in Figma is add rectangles, which again, 100% of the time, I just press the R hotkey. That is not hard to remember. But if I want to make a little search bar, I can just click and drag a rectangle onto my page. And oh no, we have a problem here. The search box has completely covered the word search. Well, this is a great time to talk about the layers panel that's on the left here. The way Figma works is that everything you put onto your page becomes a layer in the layers panel, and the layers that are closer to the top of the list are the ones that are visually obscuring the things that are lower in the list. So if it's on the top of the list, it's going to be on the top of the page. So if I find the search layer, I can click it and I can drag it so that it's above the rectangle and now it's visible. But of course, if I've got a ton of stuff on the page, this is basically impossible. And much more common, what I'm going to do is just select a layer and do something like Option Command open bracket, which sends it to the very back of the list, or Option Command close bracket, which sends it to the very top. Once I'm using hotkeys, it's also useful to know the one for just switching something one position in the layer list. So Command open bracket is going to move your layer down by 1, and Command close bracket is going to move it up by 1. So this is what we want right here. Perfect. Now, to be honest, most of the time, I actually keep the layers list hidden. I don't find it that useful. And to do that, just press Command, Shift, \. And of course, you can also do this from view menus. Now, this search bar, we actually want it to be pretty dark like the background. The easiest way to make it dark is, well, I'm going to make it white, but then just to adjust the opacity directly. This gives me a lot of control with how much it blends into the background. And 10% is fine for our purposes for now. By holding Option, I was able to duplicate this right here, and I want to see where my grids are. So I'm going to press Command G, and I'm just going to make 3 cards here for related articles. So I'm holding Option to duplicate and Shift to constrain the duplicate to horizontal, and then Command D to make one more duplicate with the same spacing. I can select all 3 and drag them to be a little bit bigger. Now if I get my grids out of the way, press Command 0, it's kind of what we're looking at. I'm still not able to see the whole page, and if I want to do that, then I'm going to have to remove the rulers. So I press Shift R to toggle the ruler visibility, and Command \/ will toggle the visibility of the rest of the UI. Now, if I press Command 0, I'm at a zoom of 100%. I'm looking at this how a user would see it on the web. And I'm just going to adjust the spacing real quick, give things a little bit more breathing room, which is generally a great idea. And there we go. So we've added some rectangles here. The other big shape that you're going to be adding in Figma most of the time is an oval or a circle. You can constrain it to a circle. So that's the ellipse. Press O. I think of O for oval. And maybe a good place to add one is a little profile button with the user's profile photo or something in the upper right. So there we go. And of course, by pressing Shift R, we can see where our rulers go and constrain things to line up there. And I'm just going to real quickly fiddle with the spacing here. I'm going to make things consistent on both the top and the bottom, say 12 pixels of spacing. Now this is actually a good chance to talk about plugins. Figma's community of users has created thousands of incredible plugins, and today we're going to use 2 of the most commonly used ones in my book. So to access plugins, you're going to go to this menu. This is the resources. Shift I is the hotkey, as you can see. And I've got a whole bunch of stuff going on here. Basically, just navigate on over to plugins, and you're going to see this little world icon for from the community. And it's going to open up the Figma community in a new tab. From there, go ahead and search material design icons. This is going to be one that we're going to add. The first result is the one that has 1 million users. That is definitely the one that we want. So you can say open in, untitled, and you can run it without really downloading anything at all. So material design icons, we're actually going to use these and have a little icon for each nav item. For dashboard, I'm going to search chart, press enter. I'll search favorite to get a heart, which will work for HRV. Notifications will work fine for a bell for alerts. For log, I'm going to search for a list icon. This one will do just fine. And for library, I'll have some sort of bookmark. And actually, because these ones kind of have an outline style, I'm actually going to try and get an outline style for all the icons, including the heart and the bell. That'll just be one more way of having a little bit more consistency. Now, right now, these are all black icons. So I'm going to select them all, and then I can align them left here. Of course, there's hotkeys for all of this stuff. That's just going to get them looking a little bit neater. And because I have multiple layers selected and they all include the color black somewhere in there, one of the selection colors that is surfaced up to me is black. I can change all of the black in my selection to white by just pressing F, enter, and there we go. Now I can drag them onto my dark dashboard. I'm going to be able to see them all, no problem. Now clearly I need to get them all positioned nicely. So one quick way to do that is just to see if I have, let's say, a line height of 20 and a paragraph spacing of 22, that means each line here is 42 pixels tall. And if each of these icons are 24 pixels tall, that means I'm going to need to have, what is it, like 18 pixels of space between them. I can just do this tidy up, which is going to make the spacing consistent. Here it is at 35. This little box appeared, and this is the spacing adjuster. I can then adjust this the same way I would anything else and get the spacing to exactly where I want. Now the other plugin that I want to use, I can go here and search Content Reel, R-E-E-L. And there's one by Microsoft, which I can go ahead and just open up, no problem, run it in my file. And basically this allows me to really easily put in filler content like names, lorem ipsum text, dates, etc. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select the oval that I dropped in here. And instead of being at home, I'm going to go over to image because I'm going to want to drop in an image. And I'm just going to choose avatars. And when I do that, it's going to fill in a random photo. And I can keep clicking it if I don't like the first one. I can just keep clicking it until I get one that I like. So that's a very simple way to add in a avatar image in Figma. Now you're going to notice one thing real quick. In the layer list, any layer that has an image fill is going to appear as an image right here. And the image is not really like so much a type of layer as much as it is a fill that goes into a layer. So that's just one interesting thing to keep in mind in Figma. I can actually select this fill just like any other, and I can do things like Command X to, remove it, and then Command V to paste it back in. I can transfer it between layers, whatever I want to do. So let's hide my UI with Command Shift backslash and Command backslash. Maybe select this, Shift 2, Shift 0, zoom in. I'm centered, I'm good to go. Now, in our tour of Figma tools, one thing we haven't talked about is the pen tool, which is right here. Now, there's a pen and a pencil. I'm just going to really quickly say the pencils for drawing stuff like this, and it turns out pretty scribbly. So most of the time, I don't ever really use the pencil tool. So I press V to switch back to the selection tool and delete it. The pen tool, on the other hand, is a little bit more useful, and we're going to be using it to draw a little graph here. So I'm going to go to pen, and then I basically click, it puts down my first point, and then I can just kind of add points as I want, just scrolling around, clicking where I need to, and here we go. When I'm done, I can press enter, and that completes the shape. And you'll see, it's hard to see. The default color is black again here, so I'm going to make that white just so we can see it real quick. And I'm going to give it a slightly thicker stroke here of 2 instead of 1. So now it's much easier to see. Now, to be honest, there's way more to vector drawing, that is the pen tool, than just drawing jaggedy line segments. If I press enter, I can go back into edit mode here. I'm going to select my point that I want to keep going with. And you'll notice I'm not actually in the pen tool right now. So if I press P for the pen tool, now I'm back there. And I can keep adding either points like this, or if rather than clicking, I click and drag, I can make a smooth point. I can also hold shift to constrain the Bezier curve, as it's called, to have a horizontal little point like that, or vertical, however I want to do it. Now, in this case, I don't actually want to do any of those things. So I'm just going to do Command Z, undo that, and call it a day. What I would like to do is make a duplicate of this shape, but do something a little bit special. I'm going to press Command D to duplicate it, so it's pasted right on top. You can't see that there's 2 right now. I'm going to press Enter to go into edit mode, select my latest point, press P to go back to the pen tool, and I'm actually going to close the shape. and it's going to align. I'm holding shift to keep everything aligned here. It's going to align with the bottom of the x-axis, and there we go. If I close up the shape, I can now press enter and I can give the thing a fill. And I can either do that by pressing fill here and then removing the stroke, or a great hotkey is to switch the stroke style and the fill style. Just press Shift X. Now it's an opacity of 100%. That's way too much. So I'm going to do 1 just to set the opacity to 10% so I can see it's there, but I'm actually going to modify this style a little bit in just a minute. Before we do that though, I'm going to show one other use case for vector editing. So all text in Figma is technically a vector. A vector means you can zoom in on it infinitely and it never becomes pixelated. It's a shape that's defined by math. So that's kind of a cool feature. I'm going to make a little logo here that shows off what it's like editing text as a vector in Figma. So let's come up with a name for this app. Maybe Heal. It's kind of a boring name, but it sort of fits the theme. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger here. Give it a little bit more line spacing, or letter spacing, excuse me. We'll just kind of put it here where it feels vaguely centered. Let's see how that looks. Something like that. That's fine. But maybe I want to emphasize in my little, makeshift logo here that there's different kind of levels of things that you're monitoring. And so I want to change this E to be 3 horizontal lines. I want to remove the vertical part of the E. Well, what I have to do is change the text layer into a vector layer. So if I press Command Shift \, you can see this is a text layer. That's what the T means. But if I go up to Object and then I go to Flatten Selection, or Command E, which again is what I'm going to use, it actually changes that text layer into a vector layer. Like if I press enter, I see a whole bunch of points here. This is no longer how text works. This is just a vector layer at this point. So I can just easily click into the predefined points here and maybe hold shift to make sure I'm drawing lines. But basically, one thing that's important to know about Figma's vector functionality is you don't have to just draw a shape that kind of traces out one path. You can actually have little line segments that crisscross at different points. And so I'm actually creating line segments that crisscross the vertical stem of the E and subdivide it into 5 little rectangles, right? So now this basically is one shape with 5 sub-rectangles. Then I can go to this paint bucket tool. This is a paint bucket. It's, I guess, a bit of a weird icon. And any of these sub-rectangles, I can click to toggle the visibility, like whether or not it has a fill. So now by pressing escape a couple times, I'm going to hide my menu with Command Shift \. I'm going to press Command 0 to zoom out. And look at that. Very easily, we have something that at least looks like a little bit cooler of a logo. Now, we've talked a bunch about text and shapes, but I think we need to dive into color in Figma. And color is something that I like to apply very judiciously. I think it's very easy to overdo color as a beginning designer. So we're going to put some on the data line because that's a really important thing. And then we're going to show the selected state of the dashboard with color. But other than that, we're going to try and just be pretty judicious about it. Now I'm going to press Command \ to pull up my layers panel here. Like I mentioned in the beginning, our theme is going to be kind of centered around turquoise. And so if I pull up this stroke and I'm in the HSB color system, that means the hue is going to be around 180. And don't worry, you will just learn these hues over time. And I'm going to make the saturation and brightness both 100, which just makes it really rich, really bright, really visible. It's not actually what I would do, but we're going to adjust things in just a sec here. All right, and now this color is definitely too vivid, but the main point here is I'm actually going to take this color, I'm just copying the hex value, and then I'm going to go paste it in a couple places. I'm going to go paste it into this icon, the selected icon as a selection color. Fantastic. I'm going to select this part of the text here, and I'm going to give it a fill of that color. Awesome. And again, this looks pretty funky now, but here comes the trick. When I select the entire frame, I can now edit all instances of that color just by going down to the selection color here. And I can say, you know what? Let's adjust the hue, saturation, and brightness to be what we want. Now, in the HSB color system, if I say, well, I want this to be a little bit greener, I look, green is a lower hue, so I'm just going to lower this value, and that's the equivalent of adding green. Even 170 is a much better effect. And then this is actually a graph of saturation versus brightness. So you'll see those two numbers change as I kind of piddle around here. And I can just move until I find something that feels about right. So 170, 69, 86. That looks, good enough for now. We'll keep working with it. Of course, like all things in design, you should always reserve the right to change your mind a little bit later, but for now, this works fantastic. And we only have one screen here, but as soon as we start having multiple screens and maybe different pages in Figma, changing colors can be a little bit of a mess. So one thing that really helps is to turn them into variables, which is a newer feature in Figma. So if I go to selection here and I find that brand turquoise, I can say click new variable. And again, like I said, I can just call it brand turquoise or whatever I want and say create variable. Now it automatically found all selections that contain that color and made that color into a variable. The stroke is not an editable value, it's brand turquoise, right? And if I want to edit brand turquoise, what I need to do is click somewhere outside of the frame, and then I have local variables. I can bring it up and I can edit it here. If I edit it here though, all instances will edit at the same time, and not just on one page, but across all pages. Now I want to have a little highlight box around my selected nav item. So I'm going to create it. 42 was the correct height, if I recall correctly. And then if I just do Option Command open bracket, it's going to send this rectangle layer down to the bottom so I can see my text in front of it. And what I'm going to do for the color here is I'm going to choose the variable that I just made. So if I go to libraries, brand turquoise is what I'm going to pick, but I'm going to adjust the opacity to 15%, which if I just press 1.5 and rapid succession, there we go. That's easy enough to do. And that sort of creates a variation on my brand turquoise color that's mixed with the background. That's what the opacity is doing. And in my opinion, creating color variations is a super underrated skill in UI design, and I've actually linked my article on it below. And just to create one other color variable, I'm going to select these icons. I'm going to go to the selection color, and maybe I'll start with this but maybe do something that's a little bit bluer. I'll do much lower in saturation, so that's going to be duller, and I'm also going to make it much darker, so it kind of fades into the background. The idea is they need to appear inactive but visible. So maybe something like that is a little bit better. Then I can press plus to turn it into, let's say, inactive icon color. Now there's a lot of theory to how to name variables well. We're not going to get into that now, but just for now, these names will work fine. If we're talking about color in Figma, we can't not talk about gradients. So gradients are a great way to add some pizzazz to your designs, and I recommend getting comfortable with their functionality ASAP. Now, first, let's do a gradient that kind of has that creates a cool effect under the chart here. So what I'm going to do is open up the fill. I'm going to go to gradient mode, and then I've got this linear gradient. I'm actually going to select my theme color for both stops. That's the top stop is where the color starts, the bottom stop is where it ends, except the bottom stop, I'm going to make 0% opacity. So it's going to go from 100% of my brand color to 0. Can't see it right now because this is at 10% opacity as a layer. But it would look like this, except now we can select it and we can easily adjust it to be as subtle as we want. So maybe something like 20% opacity. Just kind of adds this cool glow to it. I think it looks awesome. Now we have these related articles down here, and normally there might be like a preview image for the article or whatever, but let's just use this as an excuse to talk a little bit more about gradients. So if I go to fill and I go to gradient, you're going to notice I have this drop down here. Linear gradient is the default where the color sweeps kind of across the direction of a line from one color to the next. A radial gradient is where it's a circle and the center is one color and the outside is another color. So maybe I'll say, the circle can be something kind of more like our teal or whatever, and we'll make the outside, say, a little bit more purple. Now, I need to adjust the visibility here so we can actually see it. That needs to be 100%. There we go. Now, this looks pretty like terrible tie-dye, but we can adjust the size of everything using these little handles. Get things just to our liking. With a radial gradient, if we kind of put one stop off to the side, it's often kind of a cool effect too. Another type of gradient that is pretty useful is an angular gradient. And this is where the degree value around a circle determines what color that you see. And we can just do something like, say, go from a red to a yellow. Of course, this needs to be at 100% opacity. And with these angular gradients, I actually sometimes prefer to just drag them off, like drag the center off of what's visible, and that makes the whole gradient feel a little bit smoother. So now we've got kind of this fiery glow here, but and it's not necessarily clear that it's one gradient, but it just has a cool effect to it. Now, one practical tip about gradients is when they cover a very wide range of hues, sometimes what happens is in the middle, they turn a little bit gray. They get a little bit dull and they don't look as good. So I actually created a tool, and this is linked below, where you can go and create a gradient over a very wide range of hues, and it still keeps the middle looking very brilliant and interesting. So I'm going to do that, and then you can export as an SVG. Once you've saved it, it's like super easy just to drag the SVG into Figma, and now I have this gradient that I can use. So I'm going to select this fill, and once I select the fill by clicking in this little space, press Command C to copy it, and I can just paste it anywhere I want. Now with gradients, I can adjust the direction, do whatever I need to do to get it looking really interesting. But this is just a quick and simple way to like really add some more interest to the color. Gradients are really handy for that. Now, unrelated, but I'm just going to round the corners of these boxes because they appear very sharp. So if I go up to this property right here, that's the border radius. I'm going to give it something like 4. And just again, in the name of consistency, I'm always going to be adjusting other layers to be consistent. Now, these articles obviously have names. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate this layer, Option, Command, close bracket brings it to the top. And I think I'm going to need to bring the size down a little bit. I'm just going to get it to be exactly the right size that I want and give these some names. Now, no Figma tutorial would be complete without talking about shadows, which are a critical part of making a design feel natural. This design is going to be fairly flat, so we're not going to add many shadows, but we could talk about it just by adding some to this text. Adding a shadow to text is one of the easiest ways to make text on a variable background more legible. And it's one of the 6 classic ways of making text on images and colored backgrounds easier to read. There's more on that linked below. To add a shadow, I'm going to go to the effects section right here, and I can choose from these 4 effects currently. Drop shadow is the default, and it's a little bit weird, but this is a like sort of a settings button. I can click this, and there I get all my shadow properties. Now, the X value is where the shadow is horizontally. The Y value is where it is vertically. X is almost always going to be 0 because the light source will be directly above what the shadow is cast on. But for the Y, I'm going to keep this pretty tight. And typically 1 or 2 pixels is totally fine for something like text shadow. I can also keep the blur pretty tight too. It's going to be a little bit hard to see. If I increase the strength of the shadow, this is the opacity, you'll see what it looks like to go from a blur of 12 down to a blur of 2, back up to 12. So again, a Y of 1, a blur of 2, they're very small values, but this is going to work just fine for something like a text shadow. The opacity around 25%, that probably would be fine. What I'm going to do here is I can just toggle the visibility of the shadow with this eye icon, and I can just say, hey, is this actually helping the visibility? When I look at this, does it look like the text shadow is making the text a little bit more legible? And yes, especially on this lighter one with the yellow and orange, I can see that happening. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about one of Figma's most powerful features, Autolayout. It doesn't directly change how things look, but it allows the design to be way more flexible. For instance, if we have this text and this changes to like 88 or whatever, that number got shorter. And if we wanted this to be realistic, we need this value to move over. We need to reposition this label every time the value changed. Well, if we want layouts to automatically adjust, auto layout is what we're looking for. And you basically can just select 2 items and go to auto layout and add it here. You can also press Shift A. So now these 2 have a parent auto layout, and when the width of one of them changes, like in particular the first one, the second is going to automatically adjust. Now you'll notice that my alignment was ruined. I actually want the baseline of this text aligned. And so when I'm thinking about the alignment of an auto layout, this control is where I'm going to be going. And basically it took an intelligent guess and said, I think you want to align these at the bottom. It actually was not correct. I don't want to align them at the bottom. And I'm actually already going to be going into this advanced menu, which I don't really come into a ton, but I do for saying align the text at the baseline. So if I do this, now I have a perfectly working auto layout. And when I press Command 0 to zoom out to 100%, I can investigate the spacing. And if I like it, great. If I don't like it, I can change this here. I can say, oh, I want 8 pixels. I want 18 pixels between them. You can also do something like change it to a column of items where the height of one pushes down the others, and so on. I really have flexibility in both directions here. And this particular auto layout doesn't need any extra padding around the left and right side or the top and bottom, but if I needed to, that's what these controls are for. So I'm quickly going to get that working again. Then I'm going to highlight these two and do the same thing. Shift A, align to the baseline, 8 pixels of space between them. Now, one of the cool things about auto layout is you can nest it. So if I select these two and do a Shift A, it's going to intelligently nest them as a column, right? So the down arrow means it's a vertical auto layout. And so now if I had a new line of text here, it'd push down everything below it. Fantastic. I'm going to do the same thing here. Shift A, and now I have a vertical auto layout. With both of these, again, I can adjust the spacing at the same time. Maybe, actually 0 pixels looks just fine. We don't actually need any. And then, rather than going 2 deep, let's go 3 deep. Shift A again. I now have an auto layout for both of these things combined, and I can give a space, let's say 80 pixels or something like that. 80, maybe 72, whatever we want here. Now, an auto layout is a type of group in Figma, and anytime you have a group, whether it's a frame like this right here, or an auto layout, which is kind of a type of frame, or just a normal group where you select a couple items and you press Command G, and there's nothing really too special about this group. I'm going to undo that, by the way. Anytime you have a group, you can press Enter, and it's going to go from selecting the group to selecting the child elements. If I press Enter again, it's going to go one level deeper and select those child elements. With Command Shift /, I can bring up my layer list, and you can see what's going on here. One more level of Enter, and now I've selected the innermost children in this triply nested auto layout. From there, if I do Shift Enter, it's going to select the parent layers, and eventually I'm back to the top level auto layout. So that can be a neat way to edit multiple things at once. And also, another trick I use all the time is if you hold down the Command button, you can select a child layer. Even if it's nested 3 levels deep, 4 levels deep, you just select whatever you click on and it ignores all the parents. Otherwise, what I have to do is like double click here, double click here, double click here, and then do all that. Nope, just hold Command and I can go straight there. Now I want to talk about another way that auto layout can be used to make things really flexible. When I look at these related article boxes down here, I think they're kind of too wide and I actually want to see a little bit more space in between them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn each into its own auto layout. Cool, there we go. And so now you can see that if I press Shift Enter, I select the parent auto layout. I've got 20 pixels of horizontal and vertical padding for all of these. It should be the same. Nice. Now I want to make a nested auto layout with all 3 of these together. So again, just press Shift A and that auto layout is added. If I then go to make this a little bit bigger, you'll see that it pushes things out of alignment, and that's not what I want. So I'm going to have to deal with some of the width controls that auto layouts have here. Now, in general, there's a couple different modes that you can have for the widths of auto layouts, and this part can be pretty tricky for beginners, but the key is to just think very clearly about how you want everything to behave when resized. So this right here, the parent auto layout, I actually don't want it to change widths at all, which means that rather than hugging the contents, which means its width is based on the width of the children inside of it, I'm going to set it to a fixed width. Now when it's at a fixed width, let's see what happens. It still overflows visually, but this container right here is kept the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click here, and basically the gap changed to auto. So now the width of this is totally fixed and the gap is auto. And now what I can do is change the width of these directly, the width of the children directly, and the gap will automatically readjust. So if I press Enter to get out of that text box, and then I'm going to press Enter again to select all 3 child boxes. And now I can set these to fixed. So they're fixed at 300. And then if I just bring it down a notch, they're going to automatically readjust. Of course, now we have some problems with the text here. So let's go fix that real quick. Dive into this text. let's see, it says fixed width. Now I'm going to do Command Shift and I'm going to select all three of these inner text box layers. I don't want them to have a fixed width. I actually want them to fill their parent container and not get any wider. Well, fill container is my other option here. So if I set those, I now should be totally good to go. If I press enter to select the child layers and change the width, there we go. And even 290 feels like it's plenty of space in between them. I like that. Don't necessarily know that I need to do any more. Now, this raises the question, we had this grid system and now we've broken it. And to be honest, this is one of the reasons I think grids are kind of overrated in modern digital design is what if we had other elements on this page that align to the grid? Do we change the grid or do we just accept that one of the most visible elements on the page doesn't align to it? Likewise, what if we have a whole bunch of other pages? And then especially when you take into account that screen sizes can change, having a fixed grid to me does not seem super useful. So I've included below a link to what I think you should master instead of grids. Now, speaking of updating multiple screens, it can be a huge pain, and that's why Figma implemented component functionality. So these are the features where you kind of edit once and it gets updated everywhere. Elements like form controls, search boxes, navigation, footers, headers, anything that appears across a wide variety of pages is a prime example of what should be componentized. Now we only have one page here with one search box, but let's actually turn this search control into a component. Now, first of all, I forgot to put a search icon earlier. So I'm going to press Shift I to bring up the plugins and stuff. Material design icons is right here. And I'm going to search for, it's probably search. Here we go. Drag it in. Go to the selection color, make it white. And we'll give this an opacity of 60% since the search doesn't currently have anything being typed into it. I'm going to give the icon equal spacing on all sides. And then I can select all of these things and I can either make a component up here or I can use the hotkey Option Command K. Now, if I do that, that's nice and all, but I'm going to notice that I sort of have this issue with if I needed a different size search bar, everything gets messed up when I resize it. That's an issue. So that's something called Figma constraints. And if you are making components, you're definitely going to want to get used to working with constraints. Constraints are the functionality of something when the element or the parent element change size. So in this case, we don't want the size of the icon to scale. We actually want it to be fixed left and we want it to be centered vertically. So I can make it, say, fixed to the top, centered vertically, or fixed to the bottom. Either way. There's a couple other options that you can see in here. And actually with the search, the text itself, that's going to be the same way. Then I do have this box that I've double clicked, and let me bring up the layer menu so I can see, we can rename that background. You can double click to rename, or you can also press Command R to start renaming right away. But this box, the background itself, that should scale. If I make the master component bigger, I want the background to stretch with it. And so overall, this seems to work just fine. Now in the layer panel, the master component has a kind of a filled in purple diamond. And anytime I create a duplicate of that, it becomes an instance of the component, which has a just outline of a purple diamond. And it's very typical to have the master components, say, live off screen somewhere. I can even make a little rectangle with R, give it the same color. I'm bringing up the color picker by pressing Control C, or I is the same hotkey. And then I'm going to move it to the back by pressing Command open bracket. And then, because I don't ever want to really select this background, for now, I'm going to press Command Shift L, which locks it, or I can use this little icon right here. Now it becomes unselectable until I select it here and choose to unlock it. So this component should be called search for sure. And now I have a version of search right there. And if I resize this, everything works nicely. And if I update the master component to say like have an exclamation point or whatever, you're going to notice that it gets updated on the instance component. So let's undo that. We don't really need that. Another thing that I might want to componentize is this nav on the sidebar right here. And this is going to be a little bit more complicated because we're going to have one item called like, let's say nav item or something, but we're actually going to need two states. There's going to need to be an inactive state and there's going to need to be the currently selected state. And then in addition, we're also going to define a hover state, though we won't get there for a little bit. So this might seem a little tricky, but the first thing we're going to do is, because each of the instances of the nav item component is going to have a different icon, we're actually going to start by turning the icons into their own components. And because they only appear here, I'm just going to drag them off screen to our little component library here, use a hotkey to bring them to the top so I can see them, and then I'm going to rename each of them. So I like to use this slash notation. It makes them easy to find, like they're all in one folder. But icon chart, Option Command K, icon slash heart, Option Command K, rename with Command R, icon slash bell, Option Command K, icon slash list, Option Command K, icon slash bookmark, Option Command K. Now I'm going to copy this over here, and we're going to start to build out the component for the selected state. The text will just say label. We'll throw one of these icons in here. And I'm going to bring this layer to the front so it's easy to select. I'm going to take all of these things, and I'm going to press Command-Shift-K again, turning them into a component called nav item. Now, like I said, we want two versions of this component. We want one that's selected, and we also want one that's unselected. So I'm going to add a new property, and creating a new property can get pretty tricky, but one good rule of thumb is anytime you want to be changing colors between two versions of a component, and in this case we change the text color, the icon color, the background color, you want to create a variant. So I'm going to create a variant, and it basically gives me what is named property 1, and this is default. So here I'm going to change property 1 to be state. Instead of default, it's active. And now I can create a new variant just by pressing this plus button. So active. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. I'm going to do active is true, and this will be active is false. And the nice thing about using true and false is Figma recognizes those values and will do some intelligent stuff with them. But what I want to do is make the background here invisible, so that's 0% opacity, and then I'm going to I'm going to change the label to be white. So I'll break the relationship with the variable, enter in, F there. And for this, the selection color should not be brand turquoise. It actually should be inactive icon. So there we go. There's active is false, and there's active is true, the two variants that we need so far. Now I'm going to do Command C there, and we're going to start putting these bad boys in here. Let's see how it works. I've got dashboard. That looks good so far. I'm going to duplicate, press Command D a few more times to get the other ones. But now with these four, I'm just going to toggle off active to make them inactive. Oh, and then I need to change the icon. So I actually need to create not a different variant, but a different kind of property here. I go and I select this icon, and I'm actually going to then go to the representation of the icon chart, and I'm going to say create an instance swap property. So this allows me to, for different instances, swap out which icon is going to be present. So we'll just add all of these. It's going to make it very easy to select all 5 of these here. And I really should change this to the inactive icon color, but then here in the master, change it to green. So now, no matter what icon gets swapped out, it'll always be green when it's the active state and gray when it's the inactive state. So let's go see if that worked appropriately. And by creating a property called icon, I can now pick which icon I want. And I'm running into an issue here, which is I didn't set an instance swap for the inactive version as well. I need to do that too. I should have selected both of them. Like I said, components can get kind of tricky, but let's do that. Now it uses the icon instance swap. I can go here and change HRV to a heart and so on. And I think I want to make a few styling changes, like increase the distance on the left here and also make the text in the inactive ones a little less opaque, which I'd done before. So maybe we do 70% there. And then I'm going to select, let's just select all of these icons, all of these labels. Right now they're 9 pixels from the side. I'm just holding Option to see the rulers, and I'm going to make them more like 20. And let's see if that looks a bit better. There we go. The spacing is updated. Now I want to change gears and talk a little bit about prototyping. So prototyping is where typically you hook up multiple screens and you allow the user to click through in sort of a realistic way. For our purposes, we only have this one screen, right? So we're not going to do a click-through prototype, but we're going to use prototyping for another one of its great features, which is allowing us to design and check out hover states. And a good rule of thumb in UI design is anything that's clickable should have a hover state. So maybe this search bar, maybe this profile image, certainly all these nav items on the side. And actually the nav items in the side is what we're going to focus on first. Let's design like a little hover state where if I hover over any of these unselected ones, there's just a little bit of a background change. Now, if you remember from earlier, if we're talking about a background color change, we're going to need to create another version of this component, but we're going to want to add in a new property that's going to be a variant, right? Because anytime you're doing a color or a styling change, you want a new variant. And we're going to call this property hover, and the default value will be false because that's what we already have up here. But then I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to set hover to true. And then I'm going to double click because now I've selected the rectangle that's at the background. And instead of it being brand turquoise, I'm actually going to make it white, just with a very low opacity. Right now it's at 0, but we want it to be at, let's say, like 5%. So typing 0.5 is a great hotkey for that. So to define how we actually get from this state to this state, we have to do that in the prototyping tab. So I go here and I have a couple different ways of adding what's called an interaction. I can do it, plain and simple from this menu, or I can hover over any item and click and drag from one element to the version that it should turn into. And when I do that, it assumes that I'm, turning from A to B on click. I actually want to switch that to while hovering. So the idea is when I hover on this version of the component, it should turn into this component. That's called change to in lingo, but here's a bunch of different actions that can happen. So this is the inactive version of the component with no hover, and it's going to turn into the inactive version of the component with hover when someone hovers over it. Makes sense so far. The smart animate just means that it should intelligently take all the properties here and animate them to the version of when it's hovered. And then all that remains is for me to pick a time. I'm going to do 100 milliseconds, which is a pretty good time for an animation in like that to happen. Now, this should be fairly simple. I'm actually going to say no device here, and then I'm going to press this play button. If there's a device, what would have happened when this prototype launched is you would have seen the design sitting in a computer screen, which can be cool, but is not really useful here. So now, as I move my mouse between all of these items, I can see what this feels like. And that's kind of cool, but now that I actually have the ability to move up and down and see what the hover states are, I realize I want to see this text maybe be a little bit brighter, right? And that's the value of having prototyping, is I can see what the changes will feel like before a developer even has to implement it. So maybe I make this text 100% opacity by pressing 0, and then when I go to the prototype tab, I can see how this feels, and I like it. And I don't know if there's maybe just a little bit of lag because I'm recording my screen and all, but part of me feels like maybe this fade in is a little bit too slow and I should do more like 50 milliseconds than 100. But anyhow, that's the idea behind prototyping. That's how you make hover states. And of course, if you want to make click-through prototypes, rather than saying something should appear on hover, you can do on click, and then you can have the screen navigate to different screens. Prototyping is one of those features that goes really deep in Figma, so I've also linked some of Figma's helpful interactive documentation for that feature too. Now let's talk a little bit about handing off to the developer, because a design that lives only in a design file isn't really much of a design at all, right? The users only actually see the finished site. Now the process of handing your design to a developer for implementation is called dev handoff, which is a misnomer since it's not like a baton handoff. It's not like just a one-time thing. It's actually a back and forth process, and ideally it starts before you've finished your design. But all that aside, we're here to talk about how Figma makes that process easier, and the new great way that they do that is they have something that they call dev mode. And this little toggle here with the little code icon can toggle you between design mode, which I'm in right now, and dev mode. Now, when you're working with your developer, you're going to want to make sure they know about dev mode and all the awesome stuff that they can do. For instance, by selecting any element, they can see the spacing between that and all kinds of other elements on the page. It's very easy. Remember how we set the spacing here to 72? That's automatically highlighted. Or if I select this auto layout, I can see where things are at. On the sidebar, I have, this is called the box model in CSS. If you're not a developer, you don't have to worry about it, but your developer will be very pleased to see it. And then there's a whole bunch of CSS code that they can go and easily press copy. And of course, if you're developing a different type of app, you can switch between CSS, iOS, Android, etc. Now, one really nice thing about dev mode is anything that's a component really has some special treatment in dev mode. So if I go on over to my nav item component, I have stuff where I can, like, for instance, open it in a playground, which allows me as the developer to switch all of these different properties and see what the component might look like with different icons, with a hover state versus not a hover state, when it's active versus when it's not, etc. It even allows me to quickly download any sort of icons that it recognizes as being used in the component. And if I, as the developer, have defined my brand turquoise and inactive icon colors, I can really quickly use those. And I know, though, I'm going to have to hand code this white color right here. And that brings me to another point of dev handoff, which is for a developer, every number is going to get stored in a variable. For a designer, we don't have to use variables. You saw that we used a couple color variables, for instance, but the more we systematize things and componentize things and use variables, the easier it will be to hand off between the designer and the developer. So for instance, even this title right here that says dashboard, there's a little alert that says this color is not tied to a style or variable in the design. And yes, technically it's just white, but that actually brings up one topic that we haven't talked about yet that is useful for kind of dev handoff and making everything consistent, which is text styling. So if I had multiple pages and they all had a header like this, at some point, I'm going to want to make sure that those headers are all consistent. I don't want to accidentally make one 42 point and the others are 40, right? Because then if the developer sees that, they have to ask themselves, was this intentional? And that brings us to another important topic for developer handoff, which is that one of the most important things for developers is to know, did the designer do this on purpose? Like, for this title here, the font size is 40, which seems intentional, right? But what if it was 41 pixels and a developer saw it? They might think, does this need to be 41 or was that an accident? And if we had multiple pages, what if all of them were 40? They had size 40 for the title, except one was 42. Again, then the developer has to either assume correctly or incorrectly that that's a mistake, or you have to communicate back and forth about it. What we want to do is reduce the communication and reduce the assumption. And one way to do that is, in addition to using components and color variables, to also use text styles. So if you have some text that you might want to turn into a set style where you can update it in one place and then it changes everywhere it's used, click the 4 dot icon, then the plus, and we can call this, let's just say, header 1. Now, this isn't super useful because, again, I only have one page, but let's say I have a label style here. I'm going to click the 4 dot icon, plus, and I'm going to type label. When I create this style, then I have the ability to select other text, like this should be a label as well, and just quickly choose label for this text. And now, if I edit what label is in one place, it's going to update everywhere. So again, just like with variables, I click somewhere outside of the frame, and then I can go to the label style and choose exactly what I want it to look like. So if I choose 15 points, well, then it's 15 everywhere. Fantastic. Another topic, and one that we're not really going to cover here, is spacing variables. Anytime you have an auto layout, you can actually, instead of having this be a random number, you can put a variable in here, and then the spacing, every time you use an auto layout, can actually be consistent. And between color variables, spacing variables, text styles, and components, you can make your design a lot more determined, kind of force consistency upon it, and help the developer understand your intentions as a designer. Now we've got a pretty decent looking dashboard design, and we've also covered all of Figma's major functionality. Nice. If you have any questions, comments, or things you want to see added, leave a comment below. And if you want to level up your design skills, I've got 2 recommendations for you. First, check out Design Hacks, my free newsletter with short, practical UI design tips. It will make you a better designer, guaranteed. That's at designhacks.com, also linked below. And 2, if you feel like going all in, check out my online course, Learn UI Design. Learn UI Design is a complete practical design curriculum where you watch essentially over my shoulder as I show the logic and the frameworks behind everything from layout to typography to color to responsive design. There's over 50 lessons, there's over 30 hours of content, so yeah, all students get lifetime access. Yes, there's a student community, yes, there's mentorship, and yes, there's also a bonus with dozens of hours of me redesigning student submissions. Join thousands of students from around the world in leveling up your visual design skills. See learnui.design for more, linked below. And that would be everything. Thanks for tuning in, folks. See you next time. Cheers.